But let me tell Mr. Odinga, the Kenya Kwanza administration and President William Ruto will do nothing to him. We will put nothing in his mouth to make him keep quiet. Why not for the G2G arrangement? The dollar rate today would be in the region of 220 plus. And the statement says as follows, that the country was this morning treated to the usual theatrics and a charade in the name of a dossier on the government-to-government oil deal signed between the government of Kenya, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. What Kenyans witness today is Mr. Odinga purporting to give what he had billed as a dossier, but which fell short of what can be described as a short script of hot air, political propaganda, and cheap street rumors. His purported dossier lacked any substance and is evidently part of his usual propaganda rumor mills. Mr. Odinga, however, rightfully stated that the Kenya's Ministry of Energy and Petroleum did sign a deal with state-owned petroleum companies in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Aramco in Saudi Arabia and ADNOC in the United Arab Emirates. Please underline that it was Mr. Odinga who asserted that indeed there is a signed contract between the Ministry of Petroleum in Kenya and state-owned petroleum companies from Saudi Arabia and UAE. Our question, therefore, to Mr. Odinga is what further definition of government to government would this be seeking if a contract signed between a state-owned enterprise in Saudi Arabia and one in UAE and a state ministry in Kenya is not government to government? What then is his new definition of government to government? Because this contract is signed, as he asserted himself, between the state-owned enterprises and the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy in Kenya. Mr. Odinga alleges that the characterization of the oil deal as G2G, or government to government, was meant to shield some 3 Kenyan companies from paying 30% corporate tax. We are here today, Mr. Odinga, to adduce any evidence that any of the 3 companies have not been remitting their taxes, not just corporate tax, but all other taxes that are due from them. We will dare Mr. Odinga to adduce such evidence if what he was saying was not hot air, as we say, and political propaganda. But also maybe for the benefit of Mr. Odinga and his ilk, the 3 companies, that is Gulf Energy, Galana Oil, Kenya Limited, and Oryx Energies Limited, are not agents of the Kenya government and are not doing logistics on behalf of the Kenya government. These are agencies or agents appointed by Aramco and ADNOC, the 2 state-owned enterprises in Saudi Arabia and UAE, to act on their behalf to deal with local logistics. And indeed, since Mr. Odinga is in the oil industry business, he is aware that these 3 companies, even under the old OTC system, they were the leading companies in oil importation in this country. And indeed, 80% of all the oil that was imported into this country was being done, even under the old system, by these 3 companies. And probably that is the reason why the Aramco and ADNOC may have identified them as their local agents to deal with local logistics. Mr. Odinga also did speak to the dollar exchange rate. And we want to tell the former Prime Minister, it is time for once he became honest with Kenyans. Mr. Odinga knows that there are very many factors influencing our current foreign exchange rate and our foreign exchange reserves. because he was in the handshake regime only a year ago. And he knows what they did under the handshake regime. At the time, Mr. Odinga speaks about the Kenyan exchange rate between the Kenya shilling and dollar and attributes this to the G2G government deal. He is aware that under the previous regime, the handshake regime, which was a chief underwriter and offered insurance to the handshake regime to do all the things they did of state capture, Mr. Odinga is aware that they spent $2 billion of Kenya's foreign exchange reserves to prop up the Kenya shilling. The central bank governor only a week ago asserted that position, that our foreign exchange reserves were depleted under the former regime. That depletion was orchestrated through one commercial bank owned by the powers that be that were being underwritten by Mr. Odinga himself. And he knows that. And I would dare Mr. Odinga to come out and tell the world he does not know that they depleted Kenya's foreign exchange reserves to prop up our shilling, as the central bank governor said, in order to try and assuage Kenyans to vote for them. And that is how you found the Kenya shilling trading at an artificial pricing of in the range of 120 shillings. And I think we don't need to belabor that point since the central bank governor already alluded to it. Therefore, we're only saying Mr. Odinga knows there are many factors at play with the exchange rate. Mr. Odinga is also aware what happened during the handshake regime. And we want to tell you, and Kenyans are aware, and we want to remind Kenyans, that at the time President William Ruto took over the reins of leadership of this country in September of last year, the very first corporate entities and corporate groups that he had an appointment to see, sought an appointment to see him, and he met with them, were oil marketers in Kenya. We want to remind Kenyans that at the time, and this group was led by the CEO of Vivo Energy, and you can check because it is a public domain, the president did meet with oil marketers, and they told him they were choked by the policies of the previous regime that Mr. Odinga fervently supported. The oil marketers, we all remember, were struggling to raise an average of $500 million a month to be able to procure oil to sell in this country. Kenyans will recall that at the time there were product stockouts in many petrol stations and Kenyans had to queue to get fuel. Today, no Kenyan has had to queue. And we've seen in some of our neighboring countries, motorists queuing, as was the case was in Kenya last year. Many small oil companies at the time that delegation visited the president were on the verge of closing shop, and indeed a few of them had closed shop, many of the small oil marketing companies, because they could not access fuel to sell. They could not access dollars in the market to be able to procure their fuel. And we all know that is when the mad rush for the dollar began. Courtesy, as I said, of the policies of the handshake regime that depleted all our foreign exchange reserves. It is only under this administration that we are trying to rebuild those foreign exchange reserves. And it is against this backdrop, Kenyans know that the government of Kenya negotiated the G2G government to resolve the problem created by Mr. Odinga and his handshake brother and partner just before the last elections. It is therefore very dishonest for a politician of Mr. Odinga's stature to seek to score cheap political points on the back of a problem he and his handshake partner and brother created. It is a fact that global oil prices have been spiking on account of emerging wars in the oil-producing regions in the Middle East and Europe. That is the war between Israel and the Hamas in the Gaza region, the Russia and Ukraine war in Europe. And it is also a fact that supply cuts by oil-producing countries, the OPEC countries, are there. There are economic sanctions against Russia, that is an oil-producing country, and there is an increasing demand for fuel for heating in the West with the onset of winter. And all these factors are contributing to the spike in global oil prices. Those are facts well known to Mr. Odinga. It is only recently that global oil prices are beginning to steady, and that has been reflected in the recent IPRA pump price revisions. Not to mention sound macroeconomic policies that have been instituted by this administration that have enabled, in the last IPRA review, utilization of the Fuel Stabilization Fund to stabilize prices and avoid the consistent hike in prices consistent with the global rise in prices. Also, Mr. Odinga's repeated suggestion that Kenya sources oil products for Uganda is factually incorrect. Kenya does not import oil products on behalf of any of its neighbors. The G2G oil deal does not influence Uganda's oil imports, as Uganda independently procures its oil products and only uses our port of Mombasa to transship their products through Kenya's pipeline. Therefore, the assertions we heard this morning from Mr. Odinga saying that Uganda has problems with the G2G arrangement with Kenya, and indeed Mr. Odinga had the audacity to drag Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni's name in his shadow boxing of the Kenya Kwanza regime, and we want to call on him to respect presidents of our neighboring countries and not to drag them into his cheap politics and his rumor mills. There was also an assertion that the landing cost of oil products in our neighboring nations, and he specifically mentioned the nation of Tanzania and Uganda, are cheaper than Kenya. That is another flat lie, and Mr. Odinga knows it. Because you only need to Google and you'll see the landing cost of fuel in Kenya is the cheapest in the region. Lastly, let's say it's laughable and nearly despicable to hear Mr. Odinga talk about corruption and state capture. Clearly, this is a case of the pot calling the kettle black. Mr. Odinga was a single guarantor and facilitator of state capture under the handshake regime. He knows too well how he underwrote and insured the merchants of state capture and the lords of corruption that led our country to the abyss of corruption in the name of subsidies that Kenyans continue to pay dearly to date. And indeed, all these members of parliament can confirm part of what we are considering now in the House, the supplementary estimates, the first supplementary estimates of the first budget of the Kenya Kwanza administration, include a figure of 4 billion shillings to settle part of the last bills of the fuel subsidy that Mr. Odinga and his handshake partners attempted to use to persuade Kenyans to vote for their regime and that the guys that they were subsidizing fuel for them. It is this economic burden that was left on the people of Kenya that President William Ruto and the Kenya Kwanza administration has been dealing with over the last 1 year. Through sound macroeconomic policies, this administration has been able to stabilize our economy. At least now we can see some light at the end of the tunnel from the deep and dark hole of a huge debt burden that was left by the handshake regime, or rather where we were left in that deep hole that was extremely dark, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel, or even looking up from that hole you could not see any light. Now we are at a place where we can confidently tell Kenyans that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. We know where our economy is and where we are going. Let me conclude by saying the so-called dossier was and is nothing but political hogwash, cleverly designed to incite Kenyans and resuscitate Mr. Odinga's fledgling political base that is fast sliding away on account of dishonesty and his obvious use or misuse of his supporters as a negotiating tool for selfish personal interests. That is a statement, and I think from the conclusion of that statement, and in view of what you have seen from the weekend, Kenyans will remember the weekend, the statements delivered by senior members of the Azimio coalition, culminating to the statements made by Mr. Odinga himself and another group of Azimio leaders yesterday somewhere in Westlands. And the so-called dossier, which we are saying is nothing but political hogwash, is a well-choreographed campaign to try and incite Kenyans against the current administration, to try and incite Kenyans around the question of the cost of living, because, and you know where I sit with our colleagues in Azimio in the National Dialogue Committee, and you know that is a matter that has been on the table, and they probably think they can now use the masses to arm twist the Kenya Kwanza government to reintroduce fuel and food subsidies that were fueling and driving corruption that was benefiting those who were in power then. And because some of them had planned and knew the plans they had to perpetuate that culture of subsidies, especially around fuel, they imagine that they can use either the dialogue process or the hogwash that we have seen being billed as dossiers to blackmail government to institute or to carry on with the state capture charade of subsidizing fuel. Kenyans were said to have gone to the streets, as they have always said, on the basis of the cost of living. But we also know it's not true. They mobilized their supporters to go to the streets on account of what they billed was a stolen election. When that did not sell, they billed it as a fight for the cost of living, and you remember what they called the Sufuria movement, putting sufurias on their heads, apparently because of funga prices. The desperation you see with Mr. Odinga today and his ilk is because they can see and they can attest when they walk into supermarkets, the price of unga has gone down from a high of 230 shillings per 2 kg bag to a low of 145. Some brands as well as the 135. Part of the most expensive brands in the country now are going at 157 to 162 from 240 shillings only 6 months ago. We understand Mr. Odinga's desperation, but we want to ask him to be honorable enough and to be honest enough with his supporters and with Kenyans. Asanteni.
More Radio 88.2 FM. We are in charge.